we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time joining us, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always like to say, you know, there's different ways you can support the podcast. Check us out on our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod. You can reach us anytime. You can hit us up if you got an idea for a topic for us to cover. If you want to come on the podcast, hit us up on Twitter or our Instagram at the Bigmark Pod, at the Bigmark Podcast. And if you're watching on YouTube, please like the video. Please subscribe to our channel so you know when we're going to get when we drop our next video. And if you're listening, wherever you're listening, please rate and review and tell your friends about the podcast, please. Today, I wanted to kind of go over another topic. And last week's episode, we talked about Pearl Jam, which, again, one of my favorite bands. And obviously, they came out of the 90s grunge explosion, and, it was just such an amazing time for music. And, of course, one of the biggest players in that entire story, if you will, one of the biggest bands anyway, was Nirvana, and, of course, their lead singer, Kurt Cobain. And, at the time, Nirvana was the biggest band in the world, and, everyone knew who Kurt was, but Kurt was tragically found dead, and his death was ruled a suicide, and it became this huge deal. He's in the 27 Club, I believe, and, Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison, Janis Joplin, that whole crew, Amy Winehouse, gone too soon kind of folks. And, Nirvana's lyrics and music was really heavy, and people kind of knew them for that. And, it just made sense that, Kurt killed himself, and, it was kind of like the poetic ending to his kind of tragic character. But throughout the years, there's always been grumblings. There was a documentary released a few years ago, or I forget the actual date, called Kurt and Courtney, and it kind of talked about that there was a little bit of, mystery, if you will, kind of surrounding Kurt's death. A lot of people hoped that Kurt never killed himself, but, again, just the circumstances around it, everyone just kind of thought, yeah, for sure, that makes sense. They kind of put two and two together. But a few years ago, there was a documentary released called Soaked in Bleach. And it's interesting, I'll get into that a little bit. It's kind of hard to call it a documentary. It's not quite a biopic, but it's really interesting information. And again, I'm kind of talk about mostly this documentary here and the information kind of in it. But it's kind of surrounding obviously Kurt's death, but go check out the documentary, obviously, if you haven't seen it, because there's going to be some spoilies, but they're heavy duty. So, right off the bat, before we kind of really get into this was kind of a topic that I wanted to broach with some sort of respect and some sort of decorum, if you will. I respect everyone involved here. I don't want to cast aspersions against anyone. I don't want to dredge up old shit that's gone and, make anyone feel uncomfortable, and especially talk about a situation obviously I don't know anything, or I am so far away from and have nothing to do with personally. Obviously, my whole podcast is based on talking about stuff like that. So, but again, all the surviving members of the band, anyone who knew Kurt, anyone who loved him, anyone who was around him, I mean no disrespect, of course, and all this information you have to take with a grain of salt. It's tough with all this thing, with anything like this. It's gone. Kurt's long gone, and his body is no longer here. So it's hard to. What are we gonna do? Retroactively go after people, I guess, potentially. But we'll kind of get into the reasons why that might be even difficult. So obviously, like I said, this is going to kind of surround the story of Kurt Cobain's death. The first person who actually discovered him was an electrician, and he found him in his own home on April 8th, 1994. Again, this, a lot of the information that comes here next, Kurt went missing for several months before his death. It's missing is interesting, right? Because it just kind of depends on who you ask, and we'll get into it here. So when Kurt was missing at this point, Courtney Love, Kurt's wife at the time, hired a PI by the name of Tom Grant to locate Kurt. And basically after their first meeting, Tom started recording every correspondence. Again, a little bit about this movie. Like I mentioned before, it's not quite a biopic. It's not quite a documentary, although it has elements of everything. There's interviews with real people. Tom Grant's in it, heavy duty. But basically what they kind of do is they do reenactments of scenes from Kurt's life, or from real life. There's these recordings that Tom Grant has done that he started doing after the first meeting with Courtney, that the filmmakers basically play as the dialogue. So the actors are just kind of like mouthing the words that are actually being said by the real people on these tapes. So it's really cool. It gives, I think, a fairly accurate portrayal. Obviously, there's still some artistic license that kind of is probably taken in the movie itself, but again, this is being backed up by the PI himself. Again, he's heavily interviewed in the movie, and it's such heavy subject matter, and again, it's something that I feel not too many people want to touch because of just the emotions surrounding it too. And it was heavy, and it was a heavy time, and it was an emotional time, and people that were directly involved were able to kind of express their emotions, being artistic type people. I feel like it was dramatic in a way that, not every person's death can be. And, Nirvana was the biggest rock band in the world, the biggest band in the world at the time. And Kurt dying like this was crazy news. So again, it was a really, really interesting movie, and I suggest going to check it out. So a little bit about Tom Grant. He was a longtime LAPD police officer who actually left to become a personal investigator. And it's interesting, a lot of PIs are actually kind of shady type people, but Tom actually had an exemplary record. He had no dirt on him, and he kind of just became he left the police force in great standing. And, became a PI because, that was a business he wanted to run. Courtney first contacted Grant and his partner on April 3rd, 1994. So 5 days before Kurt's body was found. She claimed, Courtney claimed that someone was using her credit cards unlawfully. And essentially, she just kind of it seemed like she wanted to kind of like go around calling the police directly for whatever reason. So she also called on a holiday. So Grant was probably one of the first people that picked up. She probably got to G in the phone book under PIs, and she called up Tom. So Tom goes to her place with his partner to meet for the first time, and the first thing she says, and I quote, "If you leaked this to the press, I'll sue the fuck out of you." That's the first thing she says to this guy. So it's like, nice greeting. You know what I mean? Essentially, she was supposed to be doing this in-home rehab where I guess she probably worked out a deal potentially where she could, do this at home. But she was clearly high on something. According to Tom, she was wearing a negligee, and he said she might as well have been wearing nothing at all. She told Tom that actually the credit cards weren't stolen, so she actually lied to Tom about the whole scenario. She just canceled the credit cards to try and get Kurt back. So again, she was kind of doing some desperate stuff already just to kind of get Kurt out of, or to find him. She's looking for him, clearly. And Kurt is not necessarily missing. He's just essentially avoiding Courtney at this point. Courtney goes on to tell Tom that Kurt is helpless and suicidal, and just acting generally strange, as far as Tom was concerned. So after that meeting, Grant started documenting everything. The film also interviews a lot of the townspeople of Aberdeen, Washington, some friends and people who lived around Kurt. And one of the people actually makes a really interesting point in last week's episode. I talked about the explosion coming out of the Seattle, Washington area. Basically, Washington State had so much music kind of coming out of it. And one of the people that were interviewed, which was one of Kurt's childhood friends, said basically the reason why there's so much music is kind of due to the weather. You know, people stay inside and they can't really go out that much. It's dreary 9 months of the year. It's raining. And, you know, people learn to play music. And maybe that's the same thing on the East Coast of Canada. You know, people have to stay inside, and it forces you to play some tunes to keep yourself occupied. But most of the townspeople, again, all these people that were around Kurt when he was young, mind you, of course. But you know, if he was 27 when he died, it wasn't that much longer. So they knew him when he was 18 or whatever. You know, I guess 9 years isn't, you know, that much of a difference. But basically all they said, you know, Kurt had a really rough home life, but, you know, he never really showed outward signs of kind of emotional issues. So it's hard to say, you know, what anyone's feeling on the outside. But hey, essentially, so back to the story here. 4 days before they found Kurt, Tom actually spoke with Courtney, and she mentioned divorce a lot in this meeting, which was strange. She didn't really talk about that much. She was clearly jealous of people around him. She was jealous of the bass player in her band. She kind of suspected Kurt of cheating on her with him. And to try and lure Kurt out, because they still couldn't find him at this point, she planted a story in the news that she OD'd and went to hospital, thinking that it was going to kind of like get his attention and he was going to come and try and find her. And she didn't. She was totally fine. In fact, she said she even spun it like it was an attempted suicide, that it wasn't even drug related, and people would feel sympathy for her. And in that same meeting, she also admitted that it would probably also be good publicity for her new album coming up. So things are a little unstable in Courtney's world. On the tapes, Courtney was coming off as very controlling and upset with Kurt kind of passing up on Lollapalooza. I guess Nirvana had a chance to play Lollapalooza and he wasn't feeling it, and it sounded like she and her band Hole really wanted to play too, and because Kurt backed out, she had to back out, I guess, and she felt scorned for that, and I guess they could have made a bunch of money. But Kurt prevented that. So she wasn't really happy with what Kurt was doing. Courtney actually filed, when she filed the missing persons report with the police, finally, looking for Kurt, she actually filed it under Kurt's mom's name. So that was an interesting point, because the media actually eventually picks that up and says, you know, Kurt's mom filed this missing persons report. She's so worried about him, even though she didn't. It was Courtney. Once again, in efforts to draw Kurt out. At this point, Courtney was telling Tom to search hotels, fancy hotels in the area, looking for Kurt. And he usually uses a pseudonym, so he's probably, you know, check all the fancy hotels. She was really specific about fancy hotels under the pseudonym Bill Bailey. I think that's the dude from It's a Wonderful Life, right? Tom actually found a Bill Bailey at a hotel. He called to tell Courtney, and she actually said, "Don't go and try and find him." And he was really confused by that. It's like, why don't you want me to pursue? I think I found him. And then 15 minutes later, Courtney called Tom back saying that she actually called the hotel and said it wasn't him, it was someone else. So that was, Tom was like really confused by that. It's very confusing. She also refused to have any surveillance on their house in Seattle because Tom had some partners in Seattle, and he said he could have had someone there surveilling the house, right? Like Kurt could come home, like why not watch the house? But Courtney didn't want him to. Courtney's ex-boyfriend, Callie DeWitt, was a live-in nanny for Frances Bean Cobain, which is Courtney and Kurt's daughter. And right away, she tells Tom that she doesn't really trust him, even though he watches her daughter, and obviously they were together before, which is a strange kind of scenario, but what can you do? So he's at the house, he's at that Seattle property, living there, and again, no Kurt at this point, so no one knows where he is. 2 days before Kurt was found, Courtney allows Tom to finally go and stake out the house in Seattle. So he keeps asking, let me go and check it out. And when Tom gets to Seattle, he connects with Dylan Carlson, who's Kurt's best friend. And he's also kind of like helping out, taking care of the property and doing stuff like that. Dylan confessed to Tom that Kurt and Courtney really don't get along. They fight all the time. Kurt's kind of talking about leaving her anyway. So this is kind of all the things that are brewing, right? And Courtney knows that these things are happening too. And basically Kurt is just trying to get away from her in this whole scenario here. There was one thing, again, that the media took a hold of, and I'll mention more about that. But there was another thing that Courtney talked a lot about with Tom, is that a few days prior, Kurt had an accidental overdose in Rome, and he said it was completely accidental. It wasn't suicidal, but essentially everyone thought, for sure he tried to kill himself, right? Like anyone taking pills, it's always an accident, right? But it was completely accidental, according to Kurt, and according to Dylan. He completely assuaged any notions of Kurt being suicidal. He didn't even think he was suicidal at all. Because Tom was really, really wondering, because when Kurt came back, after this Rome accident, he actually bought a shotgun for the house because there was a burglary during that rehab stint where after the Rome incident, Kurt checked himself into rehab. Essentially, Dylan was saying, he wouldn't let him get a shotgun if he was suicidal. Again, this whole idea that Kurt was suicidal is more or less general knowledge, even though it's not really true. But this is where people kind of, looked into his lyrics and overanalyzed and misinterpreted them there, right? So it's always tough. Nirvana was interesting because they kind of took, really generally happy major melodies, played them really heavy and like sang super dark, heavy words, but that combination of things made the music. And a lot of people looked at those really dark lyrics and kind of said, whoever's creating these must be dark. And Kurt has openly admitted that most of his lyrics don't mean anything. In fact, a lot of them are just placeholders, and they end up making it to the record. So this is why it's hard to interpret people's lyrics, right? Kurt also had like severe stomach pain, which was also noted as a cause. It potentially actually led to his original heroin use, but he had it under control in and around the time that he died. He said he found the right medication and everything was good. They also talked about his family, that there was family suicide in the Cobain family. Courtney herself called it the Cobain Curse. The great grandfather and uncle died by their own hands, but the real story is that the great grandfather accidentally shot himself. He was a police officer, and his gun fell out of his holster, and it shot him accidentally, and he died. So he technically shot himself, but completely by accident. And the uncle fell down the stairs and I guess broke his neck or something. And people said, oh, he broke his neck. He must have hung himself. I don't know. I guess it was his fault the accident happened. So I guess he killed himself in that sense. But again, it wasn't like they were like suicidal and trying to end their lives. So, but all of this was taken into account. And it's a really interesting, this whole story is a really interesting story about how when the media kind of takes things, how much they can twist it and how much once the story is out, you basically can't change it. Once it's out, it's out. And of course, everyone took Courtney's word for what she was saying too, because obviously she's, you know, she lost her husband, and it's awful, and it would be terrible to be this close to someone dying too. So of course you're gonna expect what she's saying is gonna be the truth. Obviously, why wouldn't you? During the time that Kurt was actually in Rome, he actually wrote a letter to Courtney, and asking for a divorce. Courtney basically summed it up to that they're like basically suicide notes and he's being dramatic and all this stuff. And she actually destroyed the notes, which why would you ever destroy that? Why would you ever destroy that? One day before they found Kurt, Courtney told Dylan and Tom to look for the shotgun in the hidden compartment in the bedroom. At this point, she had never mentioned this hidden compartment, which is super strange. They also found a letter from Callie that was super suspicious, that wasn't there the day before when they were there looking in the house, and it was like laid out on the steps, really weird. And at this point, Rosemary Caro kind of comes into the story, and Rosemary Caro was Kurt and Courtney's attorney. And she actually says that letter that they found from Callie seemed fake. And it seemed that Callie wrote the letter because at that point, he already knew Kurt was dead. So super, super odd, especially coming from someone like Rosemary, who's so close to it, so close to the case, and in a position where, you know, she's not necessarily going to. Why would she just make shit up at this point? So this brings us to April 8th, 1994, the day that Kurt's body is found. There was an electrician there to install some security lights, and he actually saw Kurt through a locked glass door. And he said right away it looked like he shot himself. So at that point, I guess he told his supervisor, and the supervisor actually calls a radio station. I don't know if he called the cops first or if the electrician who found him called the cops first, but as soon as Buddy knew, he calls a radio station, and Tom and Dylan actually listened to the news that someone had found Kurt dead on the radio. And they heard the radio announcer say that the body had been found in the greenhouse. And at this point, Dylan had never even showed Tom this room. So Tom didn't even know that this room existed, and they'd been in the house and searched it days before. So, like, Kurt's body was up in this place while they were fucking searching. So they were like right there. Super sketchy, super sketchy. So after Kurt's body was found, the paramedics broke through the locked door because it was locked from the outside. But they had to break the glass to come in, I guess. They didn't actually touch the body. They identified, and they could tell by looking at him that it was Kurt Cobain. So usually with like head wounds, or at least if you shot yourself in the head with a shotgun, you wouldn't necessarily be able to recognize someone, but they could clearly recognize them. And at that point, the story got immediately and kind of completely out of hand. I guess all these professionals were just immediately talking to the press, or the press were around. Again, you know, it's Seattle. Like, it's Seattle in the 90s. Like, anyone who's like, you know, in their 30s or younger probably at this point know exactly who Kurt Cobain is. This is like, you know, if you've ever seen the movie Singles, that's what it was all about. Like, even if you're a paramedic or something, you're probably like a pretty fucking cool person, or at least you know who Kurt Cobain is. And, you know, anyone who's out there, any press and journalists that are trying to figure it out, they're probably asking all these people questions, and they're probably half in shock. And the next thing you know, everyone's spilling beans. So at this point, after Tom found out what happened, Tom goes to the crime scene, and he told an officer who was, you know, standing there watching over. He tells them who he was, and, you know, he'd been working on the case, and he was in the building the day before. He was in the house looking for Kurt, and he'd been hired by Courtney. And the detective that was there said he was too busy to talk to Tom and brushed him off. And Tom was like completely flabbergasted by this, because he's like, how could you not want to talk to someone who was in the place, who says that they've been hired by someone? Even if they said that they had to leave, you know, in the movie, Tom goes, you should handcuff that person. If you know, that person's like gold to you, at least talk to them. And, you know, obviously it's a really high profile case, and like, who knows, anyone could come, and like, you could be, even if you're like a journalist pretending to be this private investigator, who knows what Buddy thought, but maybe didn't believe that Tom was who he said he was. But again, Tom's was very strange for them not to want to talk to him. I think at this point, all the authorities essentially just assumed it was suicide, even though they said that they were investigating all possibilities, and they should investigate all possibilities. That's why they call it a death investigation. They don't say it's homicide or suicide right away, so they don't jump to conclusions, essentially. So, and a lot of other inconsistencies that kind of came into play, where the door was locked from the outside with like one of those like little push button locks. Potentially, you know, you could always just like push it and still close it, but but I don't know why the paramedic had to break the door. Anyway, the door was locked from the outside. Reports claimed that there was a stool blocking the door, but it was simply in the room. Someone actually added that to the report later. The paramedic said that the stool was not obstructing the door, but someone said that Kurt had wedged the stool to block the door. So super weird there. Photographs of the scene weren't developed at all. I guess at that point, the Seattle Police Department didn't develop photos in suicides. But again, that's why you don't immediately deem it a suicide. And actually, the most of the photos are still in possession of Seattle Police Department. They released a couple photos once they started filming this movie, actually, but a lot of them are still in the possession of SPD, which is wild. The lead detective, Don Cameron, who actually spoke with Tom, resigned before he was terminated for planting evidence at a homicide scene, a completely different case. So Don Cameron, man, he was up to kind of no good already. It looked like he was already trying to cut corners. And again, if you kill someone who's people think is suicidal and is known for doing drugs, and you say that he overdosed on drugs and shot himself, it's pretty clean cut, and it's pretty easy to just, even if there's nothing else necessarily nefarious about it, you just think, oh, easy, clean cut, we'll get through this. But they obviously missed a lot of shit. So the Seattle Police Department's approach to suicides at that time was essentially, if it looked like a suicide, it was. So even if just it was like the responding officer showing up, and if they deemed it a suicide, they basically would just like assume that it was a suicide and treat it as such, which is crazy. So by their negligent death investigation, the Seattle Police Department allowed Kurt to be cremated 6 days after being discovered. They waited 30 days to process the shotgun for fingerprints. They gave Courtney that same shotgun to have it melted down, and allowed the greenhouse crime scene to be torn down and destroyed. So like they just, because it was suicide, they said, oh, we don't need any more of this. So yeah, here's the shotgun, here's the murder weapon, here's everything. You can destroy the crime scene, you can destroy the body. Hey, it's all over. So, you know, as I mentioned, the media basically completely blew this out of proportion. So regardless of all these inconsistencies, it basically became hard for anyone to look at this impartially. everyone just thought for sure this is a suicide, clean cut, makes sense. A lot of the inconsistencies in the media were, the media said that Kurt was unrecognizable and had to be identified by his fingerprints. But again, that paramedic was able to identify him just by looking at him and match him to his driver's license. Unlike most shotgun wounds, where usually you can't even recognize the person. The media also said Kurt left his ID out for an identification, but that was actually an officer who took it out and left it on a driver's license on his wallet to take a picture. And it's not even necessarily the media's fault, because Courtney kind of continued to leak info and false and bullshit. She told them excerpts from the suicide note that weren't in the suicide note. She continued to say that they were happy together before he died and everything. So she was leading everything. But again, when the media just completely got a hold of this and ran with it. One of the other biggest kind of showstoppers in this whole case is the toxicology report. Obviously Kurt's drug use was a major factor in this entire story. But obviously people wanted to know what the toxicology report from the crime scene actually says. So what was released by the Seattle Police Department is that his blood levels of heroin were 1.52 milligrams per liter of blood. That's so much. So just to put this in perspective, 5 milligrams, so like a small, the smallest dose of heroin injected, 5 milligrams, only results in a 0.035 milligram per liter blood heroin content, which is insane. So 0.035 from 5 milligrams, that means Kurt would have had to do 225 milligrams of heroin. Even heavy users would only take 40 to 60 milligrams per dose. So Kurt took like 4 times the amount that any human should, like, you would be fucking dead, let alone be able to like hold the gun. You'd be completely unconscious, let alone find a way. Like, and Kurt wasn't a very big guy, man. Like, the gun was probably half his size. Like, he would almost have to do with his toe. So it's like, how could you possibly be coordinated enough to pull off something like that? There's also no correlation between heroin and suicide. Like, usually when people are doing heroin, they're fucking happy and blissed out. The only reason they die is because they do too much heroin. It's not because they want to do it and kill themselves. So that's also really wild. But at this point, the official reports are still confidentially sealed by the SPD. It's strange. You think that they would have released that under the Patriot Act or some bullshit, or the Freedom of Information Act. But release the reports. Release the reports. So, one of the other biggest factors here too, if you want to kind of think about motive and you want to kind of think about certain things, on March 1st, 1994, so a month and a bit before this actually happened, Kurt called Rosemary Carroll from Munich and he requested to have Courtney's name removed from the will. And 2 days later, he OD'd in Rome. So again, we talk about motive. There's so much motive here where, again, if Kurt and Courtney separated, divorced, there was a prenup, but Courtney basically would have made about $10 million if they divorced. But if they stayed together and Kurt died while they're together, now she stands to inherit almost, who knows, up to $1 billion in future royalties and all that shit, right? So I don't know, man. She was acting really erratic. Again, it's hard to take everything, but when there's a homicide here, you want to look for motive. And not to say that Courtney was in there pulling the trigger, but who knows who she could have hired, right? Again, I wanted to broach today's subject with with respect and, you know, all that stuff, all that motive stuff, everything that happened, you know, I can't say, none of us can say, but the way the Seattle Police Department took care of things was really, really weird. And hopefully something was learned from this, and it was negligent, and hopefully new police officers and police departments can learn from this is basically how not to deal with a situation like this, right? I guess we can reopen it and then try and go after Courtney in some way or whatever, but again, this is something that is really near and dear to a lot of people's hearts, and he's gone, everything's gone. You know, maybe there's some evidence from photos and things like that, but you know, you don't want to glorify suicide in this situation either, where, you know, after this happened, there's been like 68 suicides linked directly to Kurt's death, and who knows how many that weren't, you know, some kid didn't leave a note or whatever, and who, you know, it's awful to think that maybe maybe it was, if it wasn't suicide, even 68 is abhorrent to know that someone died potentially for no reason. And, you know, it's tough, and you know, we always talk about separating the art from the artist. And, you know, yes, he wrote crazy lyrics. Yes, it was heavy duty subject matter sometimes, but, you know, it's interesting stuff. Those are interesting topics, and there's a lot of art in those topics because it's heavy and it's extreme and it's emotional. And that's why Kurt made it into music, and that's his expression of who knows exactly what's feeling inside. You know, he might not be feeling any of those things. He might be assuming other people think like that, or there's people out there that feel that way, and he's trying to put himself in their shoes and just sing to them and say, hey, you know, there's more to this, or again, putting it to a kind of an upbeat, you know, rocky melody kind of kills those ideas, right? Because it says, fuck you, I'm going to just sing it. I'm going to sing it loud. I'm going to sing it in your face. But again, overanalyzing and going back and looking at these things and saying, oh yeah, of course he killed himself. You know, look at his lyrics. You know, it's a tough game to play, because again, the people who knew him said he wasn't like that. And it was just, he was an artist. So again, hopefully there's something that can come from this someday where there's a definitive ending and it can be put to rest. And if not, again, hopefully it's a learning lesson in how not to do crime scene investigation. And again, you know, be careful of the media, because they're going to take anything that they hear and they're going to blow it up, and the truth can be stranger than fiction, but sometimes, you know, journalists like to twist shit. And once the story's out there, it's out there. You know, there's nothing, it's so hard to go back on things, you know, front page news, even if 3 weeks down the road, it gets redacted. It's usually in a little tiny footnote at the end of the newspaper, if anyone fucking reads the newspaper anymore. But this is what I mean. Once the story's out there, it's out there. So be careful what you read, be careful what you hear. You know, there's a lot of information going out there that, you know, like I said at the beginning of this podcast, take it with a grain of salt, weigh it, and know in your gut how it really feels. And, you know, that goes to say, you know, take everything that you hear with a grain of salt. Anyway, thank you so much for listening. That was a super heavy one. You know, like I said, utmost respect to the Cobain family and everyone who's involved. Nirvana is one of my favorite bands, one of my biggest musical influences. So thank you so much for listening today. Again, please like and rate the podcast wherever you're listening. Hit that bell for the notifications if you want to see our next videos on YouTube. Subscribe to our channel. You can hit us up on our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod, and you can support us there. Reach out to us on our DMs, twitter.com, at Twitter/thebigmarkpodcast, and on Instagram at thebigmarkpod. Again, please tell your friends. Thank you so much. Go listen to some Nirvana albums. You know you're right. Peace.